I'm a huge fan of video light and reflections, and this image showcases both entities. I like the use of the reflection. Although I'm quite familiar with reflections, it's important to know that if you want the reflection to be more vivid, the closer you go to the reflective surface, the stronger the reflection. So if the photographer actually wanted to showcase the reflection a little bit stronger, perhaps a position more towards the right and cropping up a little bit tighter would have been more appropriate. Also, cropping tighter would have made this image, I believe, a lot stronger. It's more mysterious. I think we've shown too much information here. I think if we crossed over her hands that little bit more and bent her left wrist, it would have softened those hands a little bit. I like the way the photographer has positioned the bride to take advantage of that light coming from the left-hand side, giving some luxury to her backline there. The suggestion of her profile is really subtle and really pretty. Also, the cropping feels just that little bit awkward to me. I don't mind the negative space on the top and the left-hand side, but cropping right on her arm there, perhaps a little bit tighter or a little bit more breathing space would have been more appropriate. Perhaps a lower camera angle would have been that little bit nicer as well, and if we got the bride to tilt her head forward a little bit, it would have just softened her neckline there. Also, it'd be great to get rid of that PowerPoint in the background there in Photoshop. If you've heard my critiques before, you probably know what I'm going to say here. I like the use of negative space, the shallow depth of field, and the suggestion of the kiss is quite beautiful. Do you see how we're photographing slightly over the shoulder of the bride and featuring that kiss? It's important that we have the person that's away from the camera or the furthest from the camera, as in the groom here, to put his nose on the outside. Otherwise, we don't see the romance and the softness of that kiss. And I usually prefer the bride on the outside of the kiss. So I normally photograph over the shoulder or slightly over the shoulder of the groom to photograph a kiss. As an example of where I'd change that rule is if the bride had a really big nose, for example, then I would have the groom on the outside. The bride's right hand is amputated. I would have liked to have seen that maybe pressed in more underneath the armpit, so we see a suggestion of those hands behind his back, or even on the side of his jawline or behind his head. When you're photographing in open shade and having your subjects in open shade, it's important that you look beyond the subjects and see what's happening in the background. That highlight on the top right-hand side of the photograph is very distracting. I like the way the photographer is not afraid to photograph in full sunlight here. Often when I photograph and I see some strong highlights on the ground, like in this situation, I would lower my camera angle and it eliminates a lot of that highlight, which can often be distracting. Giving her a soft pose, as in looking down on the sunlight, is very clever. Just a suggestion, if we turned her body a little bit more towards the light, we would have had those shadows and that texture increasing on the back of her dress. Quite a glamorous shot of the bride here. I like the way she's draping her arms on her body. Perhaps that left arm, if it was just that little bit tighter, maybe even underneath the right elbow, would have been a bit more appropriate. And I really like the movement of the veil. It makes her look so much more sensual. It appears, though, that the photographer actually asked the bride to look down. Now, as I've mentioned in earlier critiques, there is nothing, I guess, wrong with that if it's meant to be totally stylized, but it almost feels like this shot was meant to be a moment of some sorts. So if it looks like you asked the bride to do what they're doing, but it was meant to almost appear natural, then you know you've got it wrong. Now, you could position her face and say, hey, turn your face to the left and look down. Or she might be looking at you, and then you might say on the count of 3, I just want you to just turn your face to the left and look softly down. Sometimes if you pose in movement, it looks more believable. This image certainly has wow factor. I love the drama of the sky and also the drama of those repeating triangular shapes there. Very nice. It's one of those situations that you're seduced by location perhaps more than the great light. I'm just picturing this image a little bit darker. If we expose for the sky, as I believe we have here, but darkened the sky a little bit more and silhouetted those shapes and those sheds and had an off-camera flash on the bride and groom, I think this image would appear even more dramatic. I've always been a big fan of foreground-background shots of the bride and groom. There seems to be no expression or no connection between the bride and groom, though. The negative space on the right-hand side is more of a distraction than a graphic element that supports this image. Going back to expression, there's nothing wrong with looking at the camera, but I don't really feel they pull this look off very well. I think it was meant to be a cool shot, but just somehow it just doesn't work. Perhaps getting the groom to just hang his body down a little bit and just tilt his face and chin down with some strong eyes to the camera would have worked even better. I quite like this shot. The way the photographer has cropped it, it actually makes the dress appear like it goes on forever. Now, whether it was the wind or actually an assistant holding the veil, it actually gives that shot a lot of movement, the way the veil's flying there in the foreground. You know, sometimes it's tough, we're seduced by the location, but do you see the different quality of light we have on the bride and on the building? I'm sure we can blend that in a bit further in Photoshop, but always be careful of that. I absolutely love this shot. I love the negative space, the expression's fantastic, the cropping, the moment between the bride and groom. I'm just going to sit back here and enjoy it. Beautiful. Alright, we're on a roll. This looks great. Love the movement of the veil, her expression. She looks absolutely amazing. There's a few distractions there, but I'm sure we can get rid of those in Photoshop, and perhaps a tighter crop would even emphasize that movement and the bride's beauty even more so. Beautiful, well done. Of images we've seen here. Quite a few standouts. I just encourage the photographer to really refine their posing a little bit. They're so close to just being really spot on with all their shots, but just a few little refinements, and also keep on searching for that great quality of light and keep up that great expression we saw towards the end. Beautiful.